Greetings and welcome on behalf of the Lumen Christi Institute. My name is Michael Le Chevalier and I am the Associate Director here. I am excited to be having you for this event. If you're unfamiliar with our work, the Lumen Christi was founded in 1997 by Catholic scholars at the University of Chicago. And our mission is to make the Catholic intellectual tradition, in its depth and in its breadth, a living dialogue partner at the university and in our broader society through courses, lectures, summer seminars, and virtual events. We have some great upcoming events that help capture that diversity of the tradition that we'd invite you to attend and to share with others. On Thursday at 7 p.m., we launch our web series on economics and Catholic social thought with a panel on food insecurity. You will see more details about this event within the chat. Also, next week, Wednesday, we host President Dennis O'Brien, former president of University of Rochester and of Bucknell University, along with Mark Alsnauer, professor of philosophy at Northwestern, for a conversation on a Catholic life at the secular university. As today is Giving Tuesday, I'd be remiss if I didn't invite you to help support our work. Since COVID began, we have produced over 50 online public events, often with multiple programs a week, making available the Catholic intellectual tradition to ever wider audiences, from university students around the US to lifelong learners in all 50 states. We have had over 18,000 live attendees and over 50,000 views and listens of our event recordings. This is only made possible by the support of viewers like you. You can help financially support our work today by donating at www.lumenchristi.org/donate. Tonight's event is part of a partnership as well with the Bollandist Society. For more than 4 centuries, the Bollandists have worked earnestly to find and preserve the stories of our saints. If not for their labor-intensive search through archives and libraries the world over, thousands of documents about the saints and their time would have been lost. Once saved from destruction and oblivion, they have been evaluated according to the most rigorous historical critical criteria. Now the Bollandists are working to turn their facilities into a 21st century library by launching new research programs, digitizing their collections, and creating the databases necessary for this work. This will help to preserve the testimony of the saints, their example, and their inspiration. You can support the Bollandists today at the link also posted in the chat. I'm grateful to the Bollandists and to American Media for helping ensure the success of this event. At the end of the presentation today, you will have an opportunity for questions from the audience, but you can pose these questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Now, today's event continues our series on the saints that is born out of our partnership with the Bollandist Society. And to help us remember on this feast day of St. Edmund Campion and the English and Welsh martyrs, we are joined tonight by Father Sam Conedera. Father Sam Conedera is assistant professor of history at St. Louis University. He holds a PhD in history from UCLA, an MA in philosophical resources from Fordham University, and a BA in sacred theology from Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He's the author of Ecclesiastical Knights, the Military Orders in Castile, 1150 to 1330. And Father Conedera is a Jesuit of the USA Western Province, ordained priest in June 2017. Father Conedera, I invite you to unmute yourself and to turn on your screen.
Good evening, and thanks for the introduction. So tonight's talk is entitled Friends in Heaven, Edmund Campion and the Martyrs of England and Wales. And as already mentioned, today is in the Society of Jesus, the feast day of Edmund Campion and the other Jesuit martyrs of England and Wales. Although tonight we'll be talking about the broader historical context and some of the other participants in this mission. So if we can take a look here, we've got this idea of friends in heaven. I'm going to talk a little bit about that more at the end, but friends in heaven is a quote from one of Campion's, his most famous work. We call it Campion's brag, but I don't wish to get ahead of myself here. Want to begin by giving a little context about the origin of the missions. And we have to go back to the 16th century and the English Reformation. Now, the Tudor dynasty, which ruled over England at this time, varied its religious policy quite a bit over the 16th century and made England a rather tumultuous place in terms of Christian confession. Beginning with Henry VIII, who made himself head of the church in England, thus breaking communion with the Pope. But Henry VIII did not intend to bring about what we might call Protestantism in England. He wanted to keep Catholic doctrine, but be the sole head of the church on earth. Well, that arrangement was not to last, and his successor, Edward VI, though he had a brief reign, did begin the Protestantization of Christianity in England. And so he's the one who began, for example, the Book of Common Prayer and of worship in the English language. He was succeeded in turn by Mary, his half-sister, whom history often calls Bloody Mary because she attempted to restore the Catholic faith and did so, at least in part, through persecutions of people who'd been appointed during the reigns of Henry and Edward. But Mary died without an heir, and so the throne passed to Elizabeth I, another one, a daughter of Henry VIII, by Anne Boleyn. Now, Elizabeth, when she came to the throne, had been more or less raised Protestant, and although at first didn't give clear signs of what her religious policy was going to be, eventually took a course of trying to establish a Church of England that was independent of the Pope and partially Protestant in doctrine and more or less Catholic in ceremony, apart from the use of the English language. Now, you can imagine all this back and forth over the course of these decades left a lot of confusion in England. A great many people, perhaps the majority, went along simply with whatever royal policy was going to be. But there were others who resisted these changes. And if you look at from the time of Henry onward, you'll see various episodes of local, sometimes sporadic, sometimes more sustained resistance to these policies in the name of the Catholic faith. Now, in 1569, a group of nobles in the north of England participated in something called the Northern Rising. It was certainly against Elizabeth and her position on the throne, but it was also in favor of the Catholic faith. Now, the Northern Rising failed in 1569. And at the same time, or just a little bit after, Pope Pius V, who was reigning at that time, issued his bull Regnans in Excelsis, by which he excommunicated Elizabeth I. Now, his original intent was to do this so as to help the Northern Rising, but by the time the document was promulgated, the Rising had already failed. And it put Catholics in a very difficult position because Regnans not only excommunicated Elizabeth, but also said that she was deprived by her of her right to rule. So she was declared deposed, more or less. Well, what that meant was that Elizabeth and her ministers could claim that Catholics were not only guilty of opposing the crown's religious policy, but were in fact enemies of the monarchy and potentially guilty of treason. And so at this point, with the promulgation of Regnans and the papal excommunication, the situation got very difficult for Catholics in England, particularly for priests. It became a capital offense to be a Catholic priest in England. And so at this point where sort of organized, if you will, political resistance has weakened or begun to fade, and at the same time, England's Catholics are in worse position and, as a matter of course, deprived of the sacraments. There's a number of figures on the continent who are attempting to organize missions and ways to keep the faith alive in England. One of them, William Allen, a priest who later was named a cardinal, becomes a kind of a leader of the English Catholics, although by this time he's in exile, he's on the continent. And he established a seminary at Douai in 1568, whence we get the name of the famous Douai-Rheims translation of the Bible. And then somewhat later on, the English College at Rome, the Venerable English College, which still exists. And at the same time, he's in contact with the general of the Society of Jesus, who at that time was Everard Mercurian, who agreed somewhat reluctantly to establish a mission of Jesuits to send to England. And he put as first leader, as superior of the mission, a man by the name of Robert Parsons. And that Jesuit mission gets established in 1580. So there's a mission of diocesan clergy to England, and there's a Jesuit mission to England. And so these men train for the priesthood, and then upon the completion of their training, go to England in secret to carry out a Catholic ministry. Now, the Society of Jesus celebrates these martyrs under the name of Edmund Campion because he's undoubtedly the most famous of them. He had been a star young man at St. John's College at Oxford in his youth. He even, in his mid-20s, gave an oration to greet Queen Elizabeth I when she came to Oxford. And she and her ministers were quite impressed by him and promised him a long, successful career in the Church of England. He did receive orders as a deacon in the Church of England, but gradually in his study of the Church Fathers grew unsettled with that and decided that the truth lay in the Catholic Church, and so he converted. He comes to the continent and eventually enters the Society of Jesus, and after mission spent several places, including Prague and Rome, returned to England and carried out ministry in the southeast and in the north. So he returns to England. He's still a known entity, so he has to be in disguise and under an assumed name. And he, starting in around 1580, is one of the first Jesuits to come back to England to carry out this ministry. Now, the thing for which Campion is probably the most famous to this day is something called, that we call the Brag, Campion's Brag, which was a message that he composed in half an hour at the inspiration, you might say, of one Thomas Pound. And it was circulated first at the Marshalsea prison in London, but was rapidly copied and spread all around the city. And this is a document that's difficult to read without being stirred. It's brief, it's to the point, but it's written in sparkling Elizabethan era English. And it's a challenge to Her Majesty's Privy Council, so to the Queen's closest advisors. And in it, Campion gives an account of his mission, that he belongs to the Society of Jesus, that he's returned to England to administer the sacraments and teach the Catholic faith. He specifically disavows any interest in commenting on political matters, or because the issue at this time was, did Catholic clergy recognize Elizabeth as the legitimate queen? Well, he tried to steer clear of that question, but he also issued a challenge to this Privy Council concerning matters of faith, and said that he thought that the Protestant teaching could not stand up in open debate against Catholic teaching, and he said that he would gladly engage in disputation with Protestant teachers before the Privy Council to make this point. Now, this document, of course, becomes known as the Brag because some who read it, especially the Queen's ministers, found it a bit on the cheeky side. But he ends with an appeal, and this is where the title of the talk comes from. He ends with an appeal to God to, quote, see us at accord before the day of payment, to the end that we may at last be friends in heaven, when all injuries shall be forgotten. end quote. So Campion issues this challenge. During his ministry, it spreads quite rapidly across the country. And it is, as I said, the document for which he is most famous today. Now, the trouble was that when you are a wanted man, a hunted man, you are not likely to survive long carrying out your ministry. And that's exactly what happens to Campion. So he's eventually, in the middle of 1581, captured. And keep in mind that carrying out ministry was dangerous. We'll talk a little bit more about the conditions of it later. But one of the big questions was, whom can we trust? Because Elizabeth had a network of priest hunters, and they paid and usually paid fairly well for information. And so it was always possible that the people to whom you had ministered could in time turn on you. And this is what happens to Campion. So he's captured in July of 1581. Now, between then and the day of his execution on December 1st of the same year, he's engaged in a number of unpleasant activities. He's taken first to the Tower of London, and for a period kept in the Little Ease, which was a room that was designed so that you could neither sit nor stand comfortably in it. Now, at first, there was an appeal by the Queen's ministers, and reportedly even by the Queen herself, for him to set aside all this Catholic business and his priesthood, and that he could be reinstated in the Church of England. They had no particular desire to eliminate a man of such great talent, and recognizing too that if he turned, that would be an important propaganda coup. Campion refused those offers. But having refused those offers, he was subjected then to regular interrogation in the weeks and months that passed. He also was given an opportunity to engage in the public disputation of the faith that he had proposed. Now, as you might imagine, the Queen's ministers didn't want to leave the matter to chance. So he was not only deprived of any reading materials or books with which to prepare, but he was also racked several times, that is, subjected to torture during the course of these disputations. And so it's rather difficult to make a convincing case for the faith without any resources under torture. But Campion acquitted himself reasonably well over the course of this time. However, there was not really any doubt as to what would be the outcome. And in fact, in November of 1581, he was convicted of treason and sentenced to die. And he was then, along with other companions, brought to Tyburn, which is a place of execution, which now is located within the city of London, although London was somewhat smaller than it is now. Anyway, he was dragged to Tyburn and sentenced to execution by being drawn and quartered. I'm not going to enter into the explanation of what being drawn and quartered is. Suffice it to say that it's a rather unpleasant and gruesome way to die, and that would become the normal fate for priests captured in the Elizabethan era. If they were convicted of treason, which they generally were, they were typically executed by being drawn and quartered. Now, there are a number of accounts of the life and death of Edmund Campion. Probably the most famous modern one is by the English writer Evelyn Waugh. That's an excellent introduction to Campion's life and death. And of course, Waugh writes brilliant prose. But there's also a very early source, which the Bollandists have in their library. It's the Martyrdom Edmundi Campiani, the martyrdom of Edmund Campion, which was published at Louvain in the following year, in 1582, by one Estius, who was a biblical scholar, exegete of the period. In any case, this is an exceedingly rare book. It's not absolutely unique. There's maybe one or two other extant copies, but it's the earliest account we have of his martyrdom available. And this is just one of many examples of the treasures that the Bollandists have in their library. Now, Campion is a misfigure of the mission, and certainly in Jesuit circles in particular. But he's not by any means the only important figure. And in fact, we have to get some idea of the mission, we have to look beyond just the famous names and the famous martyrdom stories, and understand a little bit about what their activities were and how they went about trying to carry out a ministry in such difficult circumstances. Probably the most important thing that Jesuits and secular clergy alike did on the mission to England was celebrate Mass. And so the Mass was the most important thing of which English Catholics had been deprived. Those Englishmen who refused to attend Protestant services, the services of the Church of England, were called recusants. And recusants did not accept the liturgical changes that had happened in England, and they wanted the Catholic Mass. And so priests, when they traveled around various places, found ways to celebrate Mass. That was the most important thing that went on. And usually also with the Mass would go preaching. You're probably familiar with the desire that the priests keep it short and sweet during the homily nowadays. But in these times when Mass was so rare and such a fraught occasion, and when people needed to have their spirits lifted, there was a bit more patience for preaching. So Mass and preaching went together, and it was something in which all clergy engaged. And then with that, also the hearing of confession. So again, in these times, it was fairly common, in fact, generally understood to be the rule, that one went to confession before receiving communion at Mass. And so the priests who would travel around, when they'd come to a place where they could celebrate Mass, come to a household, they typically also hear their confessions. And then the Jesuit missionaries also taught people to make the examen. Now, the examen is a prayer that all Jesuits pray each day for, as the name suggests, examining their conscience. And partly this is done in preparation for confession and then communion, but it's also a spiritual practice of knowing one's soul and being able to go over the events of one's day and see where one was faithful and responsive to God and when one was not. So this was something that Jesuits in particular taught to the Catholics whom they encountered. There's also, astonishingly enough, some ministry of the spiritual exercises. That is, the Jesuits did seek, under difficult circumstances, to give the spiritual exercises in unusual in limited ways or in abbreviated ways to some people that they met. And it was not uncommon for men who made the spiritual exercise under one of these Jesuits to later decide to become priests or religious as well. Sometimes the Jesuits came upon important people in the course of their ministry. So, for example, the priest Henry Garnet began a friendship that lasted for a long time with William Byrd, who was the great 16th century composer in England, whose Catholicism was tolerated because he was really good at writing music, and he's produced some of the greatest compositions of the Elizabethan era. And then probably the most difficult, but in some ways most important ministry, well, not the most important, but certainly a significant one in the period, was the production and distribution of literature. Because keep in mind that the 16th century is a time where religious controversy can be carried out in the way that it is because of the printing press and because of the relatively new availability of the written word on a mass scale. And so the Jesuits and secular clergy in England and Wales understood that spreading literature in defense of the Catholic faith or literature to support the devout life, to support the faithful, was really important. And so they were able to set up for brief periods, printing presses in a number of locations. Now, these were things that were hard to keep secret, and so they sometimes got shut down and they lost them. But while they were in operation, it greatly aided their mission. One of the most important works that was disseminated in England during this time was Robert Parsons' Christian Directory, first printed in 1582. And this, by the standards of the time, is fairly ironic in tone. It was a work about living the Christian life that was admired even by some Protestants, though the author was a Catholic priest and a Jesuit, because again, it was not focused so much on the controversies at the time as, say, the works of Campion had been, but more on living a holy and devout life. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that all this had to be done in secrecy. And so here you see an image of a priest hole. There are priest holes all over England. One of the most famous locations is a place called Harvington Hall. And Harvington Hall is probably our best example of a major house, a Catholic house, where the proprietors made alterations to the structure so as to accommodate the clergy. And by accommodate the clergy, I don't mean make it comfortable for them, but rather to allow them to carry out their ministry and save their lives. So it included the creation of holes, of secret passageways, trapdoors, the construction of secret chapels. So Harvington Hall has even more than one of these, in fact. And this was done so that this ministry could be carried out in secret. Keep in mind, too, that some of these houses were fairly independent in the sense that there was a lot that could go on in them amongst the owners and their servants and so forth that would not come immediately to the attention of the English authorities. So these sort of houses, about which I'll say more in a moment, were crucial, indispensable to the ministry. The other thing is that the priests, Jesuits, and seculars alike had to come up with disguises and aliases and trades that would allow them relatively free movement. So John Gerard, who's one of the Jesuits on the mission, passed himself off for a time as a falconer. And so he had a pet sort of hunting falcon. And so he would, and he presented himself as a nobleman, and certain nobles were known to be very fond of their hunting falcons. And so he would take the falcon around, and then he'd have it fly off, and then he'd walk around and ask people, have you seen my falcon? Has it come into this town? And the reason he did that was because if you were a stranger in a town, it was very likely that you would get reported to the authorities. If people didn't know you, did as a priest. And so the falcon gave him more or less free passage because, oh, here this guy's just looking for his lost falcon, when in fact he's a priest, and this was an effective way to gain entry into towns. Now, even when the priests managed to evade the authorities, being in hiding was not a whole lot of fun, because it meant that, let's say, for example, while you're at a house, the English authorities arrive to have the place searched. So you get into your hiding place, and you might be stuck there for a long time, for days or even upwards of a week, while they search the place and dig into the masonry and do all sorts of things and try to wait you out. And of course, it was easier for the authorities to wait you out than for you as a priest stuck in one of these holes to wait out. If you didn't happen to have provisions with you ahead of time, you might be stuck in there for a long time without food, without means to relieve yourself. Briefly, I'd like to say a word about Nicholas Owen, who was a Jesuit brother on the mission, who for about 15 years or so traveled with the priests and built priest holes and secret passageways and all sorts of brilliant hiding places all over the country. Now, he was eventually captured as well. He got stuck in a hiding place and had to come out after several days for lack of food. And when the authorities realized whom they had, they figured that they could break the network, because he knew literally where all the bodies were, because he built the hiding places. And so he was subjected to rather unpleasant torture. He was hung from the ceiling by his wrists, and weight was added to his legs to make that more agonizing. And he had actually developed a hernia from his efforts to construct these hiding places, and so they put pressure on that. Now, in the end, Nicholas Owen gave up just 2 names, and those names were Jesus and Mary, which he uttered over and over again. Eventually, the torture became too much, and he died of it. But in any case, the fear, the discomfort, the whole secretive, clandestine nature of the mission must have taken an extraordinary toll on the men who carried it out, and upon the people who risked hiding them. And we have to say a word about some of these folks who were not members of the mission themselves, but who are counted among the martyrs of England and Wales, and without whose courage it would not have been possible. Now, I have to say, to be perfectly honest from the outset, that there were disputes among the clergy. So the Jesuits and the secular clergy did not always get along or see eye to eye on this mission, perhaps not surprisingly, but they disagreed over matters of strategy. Was England a mission country now, or was it a place where the faith was being restored? Would it be restored along the lines of 16th century Catholicism, post-Tridentine Catholicism, or more along the lines of the pre-Reformation patterns? And then there was also, to some extent, a national conflict among the English and Welsh. So the clergy did not always get along with each other, and that's important to keep in mind. But as I said a moment ago, really the key to the success of this mission was the Catholic gentry. So people of the gentry refers to people of old, well-to-do families, not necessarily the highest rank, but people who might not have had a formal title of nobility, which is rarer in England than it is on the continent, but who came from ancient families of means. And these people were the ones who took the risk of bringing priests into their home, who in some cases worked to spread or restore the faith among their neighbors, also at considerable personal risk. One of the great figures among this group of martyrs is Philip Howard, Earl of Arundel, who was converted from a dissolute life by the preaching of Edmund Campion, and who was sentenced by Elizabeth to die from treason, although that sentence was not in fact carried out, and he died of his imprisonment. But he's one of the many lay figures on this mission who gave their lives for the faith. And what's interesting in particular is the role that women play in the English Catholic mission. The official records that the government kept and that the church kept, which the Church of England, indicate higher rates of recusancy among women. That is, refusal to attend the services of the Church of England, and therefore of either semi-openly or clandestinely practicing the Catholic faith. Now, without them, the mission quite simply would not have been possible, because not only were they often, if not formally the heads of households, had an important role in running it and therefore providing for the clergy, but it was also the case that women were less likely to be punished in harsh ways than men under Elizabeth. And they were, precisely because women were taken less seriously at a political and social level, it gave them sometimes more freedom to act. So lighter punishments and less official regard of women's behavior allowed them to carry out a great deal of activity on behalf of the faith. And our best example of this, or perhaps the one I'm most fond of, is Margaret Clitherow of York, who was raised in the Church of England. She married a successful butcher in the city of York, but by age 21 had converted to the faith and lived for the rest of her days a remarkably devout life. Her husband said that he was the best wife that could be had, except that she fasted too much and spent too much time praying. But still, he loved her, and she was the best of any wife, Protestant or Catholic. And a number of her children also became priests and nuns later on. She was imprisoned several times for Catholic activities, for of being suspected of harboring priests, of speaking to her neighbors on behalf of the ancient faith of the old church. This did not deter her from her course of action. And in fact, after having harbored priests she was informed upon, but by a child, the authorities seem to have questioned a child about the presence of priests in the house, and he indicated that they had been present. But now the testimony of a child was somewhat dubious, but Margaret decided that she was not going to put that child or any of her family or any of her neighbors through the difficulty of a trial. She didn't want them to be complicit in what she regarded as a sham. And she knew that her neighbors would end up being jurors. And so she decided not to enter a plea against the charges. Well, the problem with doing that is, in England at the time, if you refused a plea in a capital case, you were subjected to pressing as a form of execution, which meant that you had to lay on top of a sharp, with your back on a sharp rock, and then heavy stones were placed on top of you, and so you were pressed to death. Now, they did have some mercy on her in that Margaret was pressed over very quickly with a lot of weight at first, rather than the several days that this process could take. But in any case, she met a very unpleasant death and was one of relatively few women in Elizabethan England executed in this manner. So, but Margaret Clitherow's house, you can still visit this in York to this day, and she's has a very prominent place among the lay martyrs in this group. Now, if we look to the canonizations, it's very fascinating how this came about. All told, there's in the neighborhood of 360 people recognized as martyrs of England and Wales. And this is not all from the Elizabethan period. It goes up into the late 17th century, although Elizabeth's time was particularly harsh for persecution. They're all in various stages of the process towards sainthood. And there's different numbered groups of them. Probably the most famous group are the so-called 40 martyrs of England and Wales, who were canonized in October 1970. This is celebrated in England on May 4th, in Wales on October 25th, and as already mentioned, in the Society of Jesus on December 1st. Now, when the English bishops submitted these groups to the Holy See, they were canonized on the basis of just one miracle. There was a dossier of many miracles submitted, but the whole group was accepted on the basis of what seemed to be to the authorities in Rome the most likely and of the miracles. It was a miraculous healing of a sick child. But in any case, Thomas More and John Fisher had been canonized without any miracles. And where martyrs are concerned, even in the modern canonization process, miracles are not, strictly speaking, necessary. And so this whole group was canonized on the basis of one miracle. Now, there was an interesting liturgical controversy that went along with these canonizations, because in 1969, 1970, Paul VI had first promulgated and then published or ordered to be published, the new order of the Mass, the so-called Novus Ordo Missae. And there were some, particularly in England and Wales, who said, well, our ancestors and the people that you've canonized here in October 1970 died in part for the sake of the ancient Catholic Mass. They didn't like the new Mass of the Church of England. They wanted the old Mass. And so this group of Catholics said, well, we'd like to keep the old Mass too. And so a petition was sent to Rome, but it was a very curious sort of petition. It was sent in the summer of 1971, by which time the organizers of the petition had secured the signatures of a great many public luminaries, of public intellectuals, writers, and so forth, who made their appeal not in the name of theology or liturgy as such, but in the name of culture. And among the lines in this petition are the claim that the ancient Mass belongs to universal culture as well as to churchmen and formal Christians. And by far the most famous signer of this petition was Agatha Christie, who, if memory serves, was married to a Catholic. And the story goes that when the petition arrived in Rome and was submitted to Paul VI, he was reading it and said, Agatha Christie, being a name that he recognized and held in esteem. And that petition was in fact granted. So the old Mass began to be said or permitted to be said in England and Wales under these terms. And this is sometimes called the Agatha Christie indult. All right, we've had a lot of secret ministry and torture and all sorts of other unpleasant things. Let's end on a feel-good note. Friends in heaven. Here we have this painting of the martyrs of England and Wales. Now, how do we think about the saints? We certainly think about the saints as being our friends in heaven. That is, people who have recourse to God and to his friends, to his helpers, pray to the saints and ask them to be favorable to us. The saints are certainly friends of each other in heaven. They have already attained what Edmund Campion hoped for, that they be friends in heaven where all injuries shall be forgotten. But I'd like to point out another feature of this quote from Edmund Campion. These men and women, priests and laity, went about their very dangerous activities, for which many of them met unpleasant deaths, with a great deal of cheerfulness, despite everything that they had to endure and everything that was going on, and how hopeless the situation for them often seemed. And I like to think that part of their cheerfulness was the sincerity and truth of the desire that Edmund Campion expressed in the Brag, namely that they desired the salvation of all, including the people who were making their lives and the condition of the faith so difficult, that when Edmund Campion said that he hoped that they would be at last friends in heaven, where all injuries will be forgotten, he meant it. And that he thought, as did his companions, that that was a reasonable hope, that it was a good and holy hope, that one should do what one does on behalf of God cheerfully, because one hopes that it will benefit everybody, even the people who are making one's life difficult. So these saints, these martyrs of England and Wales, let them be our friends as they sought to be friends even to those who persecuted them. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Father Sam, for a fantastic presentation. I just want to make another announcement to our audience members that we're entering now into question answer time from the audience, and I'll be raising questions that are being posted right here through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So feel free to post any questions. We already have a number coming through. Father Sam, a question from John Kuntz. He writes, Newman's conversion, another famous sort of later convert, also seems to have been spurred, if not prompted, by his study of the Church Fathers. Was there a tradition of patristic interpretation in England, specifically Oxford, that influenced Campion and Newman, or were these unrelated responses to that corpus? And perhaps you can refresh us on sort of what brought Edmund Campion back into the church.
Right. So now I think it's, to be fair and be ecumenically minded, the church fathers were not necessarily neglected in the Church of England, nor by the great Anglican teachers of the 17th century or of the 19th. Campion's contemporaries studied the fathers. Newman's contemporaries, especially Pusey, studied the fathers. So it wasn't as if they were ignorant or disregarded them, but they did vary in their interpretation of the fathers. And Campion came to the conclusion, as did Newman, that the attempt of the Church of England to articulate a middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism was not true, but was also not faithful to the fathers and could not be sustained. I can't tell you off the top of my head exactly what passages Campion read that were especially compelling to him, but keep in mind that a lot of Reformation era controversy surrounded the nature of the Mass and the sacraments, as well as the universality of the church. And so part of the conviction that Campion comes to is, one, that the Mass is what the Catholic Church thought the Mass was, rather than what it had become in the confessions of the Anglican Church. And also that the church was not limited to a single kingdom, a single nation, but that was truly universal. And that's a closely related point. If you wish to look for further reading on this, Campion published a treatise that articulates more fully his theological convictions called the Decem Rationes, the 10 Reasons, which is a series of arguments appealing to Scripture and the Fathers on behalf of the Catholic faith. And that might give you better insight. I believe it's been translated from Latin and that you can find it online.
And we actually have a recommendation from an audience member that if you visit Stoner Park, there's actually a permanent exhibit in the house right next to a false chimney behind which Campion would hide from the authorities. And we have it attested that, in fact, the 10 Reasons were written there. And this is by a descendant from the Stoner family.
Then we are honored by their presence. Thank you so much for coming.
So a question from Daniel Mascarenas. Were there any efforts at diplomacy between the Pope and the Queen to end the persecution? And then a sort of a related question to that, would the Catholic, this is from Luis Carlos Ayala, would the Catholic persecution under Elizabeth have been different had Pope Pius V not issued excommunication and deprived her of the right?
So that was a hotly debated issue at the time. So William Allen, if I understand, who was kind of the leader of the English Catholics, wanted the excommunication. Philip II, who was engaged in all manner of diplomacy against Elizabeth, was opposed to it. And most of the people who were opposed to the excommunication did so precisely on the grounds that life would become more difficult for the Catholics if it was issued. And that's in fact what happened. Now, the one interesting question is, if the Northern Rising had succeeded or not been such a dismal failure, would things have turned out differently? That is, Regnans might have been seen as a success. But perhaps the mistake that Pius V made was to suppose that his excommunication and deposition of her meant as much in England as he wanted it to mean. In other words, by the, this is decades after Henry has already broken with Rome. And so it didn't mean a whole lot to England, the general run of Englishmen by this time. In fact, it was more fodder against the Catholics. And even among Catholics, one of the questions they tried to avoid answering was, do you accept Elizabeth as your queen? Some of them, including some of the Jesuits, said they did recognize her as queen. How honest of a reply that is in view of the Pope's excommunication is a very sticky question. I mostly avoided some of the political questions in this talk, lest we get away from the fun things like secrecy and torture and all that. But I'm not enough of an expert on papal diplomacy in this period, but Elizabeth and her ministers lived in fear, which was a reasonable fear, of plots against her. Now, I don't have any evidence that the Pope was directly involved in any of these, but this is also the period where the Catholic boogeyman becomes the especially the Catholic priest boogeyman becomes a stock figure in English literature and imagination.
So we did have John Gira, a fellow Jesuit, who thanks you for ending on a feel-good note, but wants to get us back to some of the more gruesome, exciting parts.
Pleased to hear that.
So can you tell us some of the details about Campion's torture and death, which you find credible from the various sources you mentioned or others?
So I'd just like to point out at this juncture that you see how Jesuits are always sabotaged by their own. I try to do something feel good, and this young man gets it back on the gruesome track. So being drawn and quartered meant that you were stretched, that you were racked, that your entrails were removed, but while you were still alive, and thrown into a boiling bucket of water, that your privy parts were cut off and added to the mix. And then after your death, your body was chopped up into pieces and nailed to the four corners of the gates of the city of London, or used in whatever manner Her Majesty saw fit to use them. That's a pretty there was nothing special about this for priests. In other words, this is a punishment for high treason. If you've seen the movie Braveheart, you've seen a dramatized version of this punishment. Again, I was trying not to dwell on those details, but here we have it. So it was not a fun way to die, just like being pressed was not a fun way to die. Many of these men met exceedingly and women met exceedingly painful deaths.
Thank you for that, for taking us deeper into the darker parts.
Oh, yeah, no, my pleasure.
We have a question that sort of is moving back towards the lighter, but staying with martyrs and taking us a little more for a sort of cross-historical comparison.
Sure.
Do you see any similarity with the martyred Catholics in Algeria, for example? This is a question from Marilyn Bousset, who says mostly Trappist monks, one of whom left a letter hoping for a happy reunion in heaven with his anticipated murderers. She writes, it seems that this might be an attitude that we all need to have. But in your readings more broadly, have you encountered this similar friends in heaven motif?
Sure. Mm-hmm. So you do see this. Again, it depends on the individual. It depends to some extent on the period. But very often, praying for one's persecutors, following the example of Jesus, following the example of Stephen, the proto-martyr. This is a common thing that we see. Now, some don't put so much emphasis on this. And in fact, look, Campion has plenty of polemical talk as well. These things aren't mutually exclusive. But I'd say that very often in the lives of the martyrs, you do find this praying for one's persecutors, or even in sort of unusual ways, showing them kindness. So Thomas More makes a joke to his executioner, asking him to make sure that he doesn't miss. He's got a short neck. Miguel Pro, who's the martyr of Mexico in the early 20th century, he comes out and kindly pardons his executioner, says, they didn't particularly want to shoot him, but he said, no, you've got to do your job, and he forgives them. And so you do often see this sort of cheerfulness in the saints, even, and sometimes especially as they go to their deaths, because in a way then the uncertainty of that they live under, or the being chased around and so forth, is gone, and kind of that serenity sometimes comes to the fore. As for having that attitude, I certainly don't have that disposition, and maybe someday I will. But in any case, Yeah, I think it's one of the things that most astonished the world of the Roman Empire, the manner in which the Christians typically went to their deaths. And it's something that continues to astonish even the persecutors of the martyrs to this day.
Mm-hmm. Could you speak then to, and this is a question from Gerald Nora, can you comment on the relative delay in the canonization of the most prominent martyr, Edmund Campion?
Mm-hmm. So I didn't go deep with his canonization, but it's important to keep in mind that the idea of, in the period, so papally directed canonizations are a feature of the second millennium. And it's important to keep in mind that that process has typically been, with notable exceptions, but has typically been slow and painstaking. That the church has traditionally been quite circumspect and cautious about canonizing people because there's a desire to wait to see if the cult lasts. Like, are there people praying to this person? Are there evidence of miracles or other things associated with a cult? Is there other information that comes to light about the person who gets canonized that would be reason not to canonize him or her? And there's even used to be a figure in the process called the devil's advocate, whose task was to try to prevent the person from being canonized. Now, in more recent decades, where we have lots of canonizations and they happen swiftly, that's maybe become more our expectation, but that's not typically how even the papal canonization process has worked for most of the second millennium. So the exception really is the swift canonization. What's more normal is that it take a long time.
So Tom Brown asks, or he writes, if memory serves, the Protestant movement endorsed the translation of the Bible into the vernacular and providing it to the faithful, while the Catholic Church of that era resisted that movement. You mentioned the influence of the printing press, and of course we all think, to the Gutenberg Bible and other. Can you speak to some of the materials that would have been created and distributed to the English people, and what types of literature would those materials include? You've already mentioned some of this, but perhaps you can sort of.
That's a great question. I couldn't give you an inventory of materials, but I could say things like, so we've mentioned, the Bragg was copied by hand. Parsons' directory was distributed, was printed and distributed. They would have been, for the most part, tracts are big in this period. That is, things that give you an explanation, an easily digestible explanation of some aspect of the faith, and or tracts or pamphlets against somebody else. So you come up with a pamphlet of things, why the Church of England is false and has broken with the faith. Or you get, this is also the great era of catechisms. So it's in the 16th century that Protestants and Catholics alike start issuing and spreading far and wide catechisms. And then you would have had devotional works. So Parsons is a devotional work. The works of Ignatius, or I should say the works of the society, would, like the spiritual exercise and those things, would probably not have been distributed because the society in that period increasingly tries to limit distribution even within the order. But they would have been things aided mostly at giving basic instruction in the faith, or against errors, or helping people to live the devout life. Unfortunately, off the top of my head, I can't give a catalog of actual titles and materials.
Can you speak? It's not lost on me that, this is effectively a question about technology and the role of technology in evangelization. And we're making use of technology right now in a way to reach people at a time when, there's not persecution, but there's certainly limits to the sacraments. There's limits to engagement with other people. Can you speak to the relative importance of technology in this time, and maybe contrast it to the fact that it's ultimately to the witness of the martyrs that we're looking to, and not necessarily.
So to put my cards
tracks.
on the table, I'm something of a Luddite myself, mostly for lack of
We're grateful
talent.
for you being here.
Right.
Then.
Mostly for lack of talent rather than on principle. But I guess I'd say this, without certain kinds of technology, without the printing press and the means to produce these materials, without the skill of, say, a guy like Nicholas Owen, who was a master tradesman, a master builder, without the cleverness behind the disguise, without all sorts of kinds of technology and skill that is not per se derivative of the faith, this mission would not have been possible. And so you couldn't have, it would not have succeeded if you had a bunch of, well, Luddites like me running around trying to get things done. Like, these people were good at what they did and they needed all those skills to make things happen. Now, of course, in the end, the faith is not primarily a matter of tech. It's primarily a matter of faith and charity and the virtues and all that, and courage, which these people had in significant measure. So certainly they knew how to order means to ends. They had very ingenious, clever ways of doing that. But all these men knew, and with a very few exceptions, these men who went on the English mission, secular and Jesuit, they died. They expected to meet an unpleasant end. They even joked about this together when they're back at the English College or in Dewey and all these places. So I would say this: technology can do a whole lot of great things, including this webinar, but it can't substitute for any of those things. But it can certainly aid people with faith and ingenuity to do their job well.
Thank you. And how did the Jesuit mission in England go after Campion's death, and how long did the mission last?
So one of the adjustments they have to make after Campion's death is to try to get better at disguising themselves. And two, one of the other questions that arise, and this is a messy one, and I'll probably regret bringing it up, the whole question of mental reserve. When you are asked if you are a Catholic priest, are you allowed to not answer that question in a straightforward way? So this is where the whole accusation of Jesuitry, of clever answers to things that don't tell the truth get. And so this actually becomes, to some of these guys, a matter of conscience. But you can understand why they didn't want to train these guys and send them off to die right away. Now, the Elizabethan period is kind of the most intense persecution, although after the gunpowder plot in 1605, when a group of Catholics not very intelligently tries to blow up Parliament, when that fails, there's a big time crackdown on priests, and they get subjected to this. The last of the Martyrs of England and Wales, I think, dates from 1679. So it's a later period at which time, for the most part, the mission's vigor of the earlier period has come to an end, but there's still a worry that the later Stuarts are going to try to reimpose Catholicism. So Charles II is said to have converted on his deathbed, whereas James II, who was ousted in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, was openly a Catholic. And sometimes when these guys married French wives, for example, there was concern that through their wife there would be this influence. And so the fear around Catholic clergy and seeing them as enemies of the state extends late into the 17th century, even if by that time there aren't as many, there's not as enthusiastic an attempt to hunt them down as there was in the Elizabethan era. But yeah, the missions and these efforts go on through the 17th century. In the 18th century, the penal laws start lightening up a bit, but it's really not until the 19th century that the Catholic Church is able to reopen her doors and establish dioceses again. And that's the period of Newman and the Oxford movement that we talked about a moment ago.
So with this eventual lifting, do we ever see any contrition? We have a question um, from an anonymous attendee. But has there ever been a formal apology or expression of regret from the British royal family for these martyrdoms?
I can't answer that question. I don't know.
Mhm.
I remember running into, where was this? I forget. I was a tourist somewhere and ran into some people, some Brits who were, and I somehow we got talking about Campion. It might have been when I was there last summer, and I was saying, these guys died and all this kind of stuff, and that I was a Jesuit, and they're like, "Oh, sorry about that." And so, you know, I think among most people, it's sort of, well, among a lot of people, it's hard to understand what all the fuss was about. I
Mhm.
don't quote me, well, all this is being recorded. I'd be pretty surprised if there was any sort of formal apology, because keep in mind, look, I'm not going to defend the regime here, but this is a period in which there's an attempt now to pull apart, or at least to distinguish a little bit more clearly, what belongs to the ecclesiastical sphere and what belongs to the civil sphere. But these are very closely intertwined things. So, should Elizabeth have Protestantized or further Protestantized the Church of England? You can make a case against that. But you can also say that she had a reasonable fear from at least some of the Catholics in the country that they represented a threat to her throne, because in fact they did. But I haven't followed the modern history of the British monarchy's response to any of this, so I can't say.
You've already mentioned, a certain um, that people don't quite have a grasp or understanding of this. In your own travels to England, and this is a question coming in part from Connor Edmund Hardy. Um, could you comment on the influence of the martyrs at all in recent current culture in England?
Yeah,
Did, for
so
example, Chesterton or
sure.
Tolkien have a particular devotion, or
Mm,
others?
I can't. So I've spent very little time in England. I would not wish to present myself as an expert on matters English. I did, however, get up to Stonyhurst College in Lancashire, which is the descendant of a college founded on the continent by Robert Parsons. I mean, this goes way back, and this was established actually in England in the 18th century. I think technically the penal laws might have still been in effect. Stonyhurst is a really fascinating place. I mean, I felt like I was in what had to be one of the, almost the center of what remains of the faith there. And one of my Jesuit friends is not only attended the school but grew up in its vicinity. And you can see how the martyrs and the history of that school and Newman really runs deep in those Englishmen who've kept the faith. And the martyrs are kind of, I think of them as kind of a bridge, because some of them harken back to the church in England before all the Reformation, all this kind of stuff, but they're also pivotal figures when the faith becomes conceived of in that country as something un-English or against the English. And keep in mind that England is really the lone Protestant country that becomes a major colonial imperial power for
Mhm.
centuries to come. And so there's a sense, the English Catholics I've spoken to, and that's not a long list, there's something, a sense of tragedy about the whole affair for the country, and that although the martyrs did not succeed in reestablishing the faith, that they're some of the first people to bear witness not only to the faith under persecution, but of what a tragic turn of events that was for England.
So we're now coming to the close of our time. So Father Conedera, I'd ask, we never have time, of course, to address all the questions here. Our conversation comes to a close. where would you suggest people go next if they want to learn more about Edmund Campion, about the English and Welsh martyrs?
Sure.
Are there
Well,
particular translations of the Bragg you recommend? Where should they go next?
well, first of all, I have to make a little plug of my own. If you're in St. Louis, you should stop by the Catholic Studies Center in honor of Edmund Campion on the St. Louis University campus, where we're quite devoted to him. But if you're looking for further reading, the Bragg is available online, both in its 16th century English text with all the spelling differences and in modernized versions. You can read The Life of Edmund Campion by Evelyn Waugh. I think that's excellent. One of my fellow Jesuits, Robert Scully, wrote a book called Into the Lion's Den, which is about the Elizabethan mission. It's excellent. There's also a book which is very good, but also has a great title, God's Secret Agents, which is about this mission. There's a lot of stuff out there you can go to. There was a great poet I meant to mention, Father Robert Southall, who was one of these martyrs, but also one of the great poets of the Elizabethan era. You can look up, not so much for history, but he's got this poem, The Burning Babe, which is about Christmas. So coming up, that's seasonally appropriate. There's a great deal of material that one can find, but that's where I'd suggest starting.
Could you just say, since it was one of our questions, just a little bit more about St. Robert Southall?
Oh, gosh, let me think. Well, he also, off the top of my head, I'm trying to recall his biography. He also is captured and martyred, but he's left to posterity a good deal of poetry, most of it in English, although he also had some Latin poetry. Pardon me, I didn't prep this part of the talk. Do you have anything to throw in there?
No, I wish.
Okay.
This is not at all my area.
No,
So I think, though, that we'll take your recommendation of the poem. Can you say it one more time for those who have pens
Burning
in hand?
Babe is what it's called.
Excellent. Well, I think that's where we'll get to know him through his work from here
Yes.
on. Well, Father Sam Conedera, thank you once more. And I should announce that we're not just grateful to have Father Sam here as a presenter, but also for helping to organize this series going forward. I would recommend to you, if you want to learn, if you want to stay tuned for our events, as well for our upcoming events on our website. Is there a bit of lag on my end, Father Conedera?
You're good now.
Okay, great. You can register for our events upcoming on economics and Catholic social thought and food insecurity, as well as a Catholic life within the secular university at our website. I'm grateful to the Bollandist Society. There was a question about whether their works are digitized. They aren't, but you can help financially support them today to work towards that effort. We'll post a link in the chat for that. I'm grateful to the Bollandist Society and American Media for helping to make this event a success. And especially since it's Giving Tuesday, I invite you to help support our ongoing efforts, not only with this series on the saints, but all of our efforts to make the Catholic intellectual tradition as widely available as possible now through technological means, but also eventually back with in-person and hybrid events in the future. Help get word out about our events on social media, help share our materials, and help become a financial supporter by donating at www.lumenchristi.org/donate. Thank you once more, Father Sam, and I'm wishing you all a wonderful rest of this feast of Edmund Campion and the English and Welsh martyrs. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you very much. Take care.